June 6, 1944. 0527 hours. Strongpoint Wolfsburg 14, overlooking the Norman coast. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his face against the observation slit of his concrete bunker, studying the pre-dawn darkness over the English Channel. At 23 years old, he had spent 11 months manning this position, watching the same empty horizon every morning, firing the same MG-42 machine gun at the same practice targets, waiting for an invasion that his officers said might never come. Then, as the first gray light touched the eastern sky, Zimmermann saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Ships. Not one or two, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, stretching from horizon to horizon in every direction he could see. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and behind them, an endless fleet of landing craft forming up in geometric patterns that spoke of meticulous planning and overwhelming force. Herr Feldwebel. Zimmermann's voice cracked as he called to his section leader. You need to see this. Now. Feldwebel Ernst Hartmann moved to the observation slit, looked out, and went pale. In 16 months serving in the Atlantic Wall defenses, through countless alerts and false alarms, he had never seen anything remotely like this. The invasion fleet that German intelligence had promised would be small and easily repulsed had arrived, and it dwarfed every worst-case scenario the defenders had imagined. What Zimmermann and Hartmann didn't know, what none of the 50,000 German soldiers manning the Normandy coast defenses could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the largest amphibious invasion force in human history. Over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 Allied soldiers were descending on their 50-mile stretch of coastline. The concrete bunkers they had trusted to protect them, the obstacles they had planted on the beaches, the mines they had laid, all of it was about to be tested against a force so massive that German defensive doctrine had no framework for comprehending it. In the next 12 hours, these Wehrmacht soldiers would experience the transformation from confident defenders of Fortress Europe to desperate survivors of an industrial-scale onslaught. The Atlantic Wall, proclaimed by propaganda as impregnable, would prove to be a thin crust of concrete and steel facing an avalanche of firepower that would systematically destroy every defensive position from the sea and sky. Among the German defenders spread along the Norman coast were men who would become survivors with stories told only in whispers, accounts of bunkers crushed by naval gunfire, of positions overwhelmed by endless waves of attackers, of fighting until ammunition ran out and then surrendering because continuing was suicide. But on that dawn morning of June 6, 1944, they were still confident soldiers who believed their defenses would hold. This is the story of how that confidence died, how the Atlantic Wall broke, and how German soldiers learned that courage and concrete could not defeat the combined industrial might of nations that had dedicated 3 years to planning this single day. The defensive system that Klaus Zimmermann and his comrades manned had been 4 years in construction. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's much propagandized coastal fortress stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, represented Germany's strategy for defending occupied Europe against Allied invasion. Along the Normandy coast alone, German military engineers had constructed over 8,000 bunkers, strongpoints, and fortified positions, connected by trenches, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles. Strongpoint Wolfsburg 14, Zimmermann's position, was typical of these defenses. A reinforced concrete bunker with walls 3 feet thick, it housed a single MG-42 machine gun with interlocking fields of fire with neighboring positions. The bunker's embrasure provided a narrow firing slit that protected the crew while allowing the weapon to sweep the beach approaches. Below the high water line, German engineers had planted thousands of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and concrete tetrahedrons, designed to tear open landing craft hulls or trap them in killing zones. Oberst Friedrich Richter, commanding the defensive sector that included Wolfsburg 14, had spent 9 months perfecting these defenses. A veteran of the Eastern Front who had transferred to France in August 1943, Richter understood defensive warfare and believed his positions could repel any assault. The Atlantic Wall is not propaganda, Richter told his battalion commanders during a March 1944 inspection. It is reality. Every beach approach is covered by machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Every likely landing zone is mined and obstructed, The enemy will bleed themselves white against these defenses. Our position is strong. But Richter's confidence, shared by most of his men, rested on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. German defensive planning assumed Allied forces would land at high tide to minimize time exposed on the beach, meaning most German beach obstacles would be underwater and ineffective. They assumed naval bombardment would be brief and inaccurate, giving defenders time to man their weapons after the initial barrage. Most critically, they assumed German coastal artillery and nearby panzer divisions would be able to respond quickly to any landing, crushing Allied forces before they could establish a foothold. Every one of these assumptions would fail. Feldwebel Ernst Hartmann, the career soldier commanding Zimmermann's MG-42 position, represented the professional corps of the Atlantic Wall garrison. At 31, he had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front before transferring to France for what he hoped would be quieter duty. He trained his crews meticulously, maintained his weapons obsessively, and believed absolutely in the defensive system he served. "We have 1,200 rounds of ammunition per gun," Hartmann explained to his section during a May training exercise. "Belted, ready to fire, with reserve cans stored in the bunker. The MG-42 fires 1,200 rounds per minute. We can sustain fire for over 1 minute without reloading. No assault force can cross our beaten zone under that fire. They will die on the beach or retreat. This is mathematics, not hope." But Hartmann's mathematics, like Richter's tactical assessments, failed to account for what Allied industrial capacity and planning could produce. The landing forces heading toward his beach had artillery support from battleships mounting 14-inch and 16-inch guns that could obliterate concrete bunkers from 10 miles offshore. They had air support from thousands of bombers and fighters that would achieve absolute air superiority from the first minutes of the battle. Most critically, they had numbers, so many soldiers, so many landing craft, so much ammunition that even devastating German defensive fire would not prevent the establishment of a beachhead. Private Hans Weber, a 19-year-old conscript manning a machine gun position 300 meters from Hartmann's bunker, represented the other side of the Atlantic Wall garrison, young soldiers with minimal combat experience who had been told the defenses were impregnable and believed it because they had nothing else to believe in. "We will stop them," Weber wrote to his mother in late May. "Our officers say the English and Americans are soft, that they cannot stomach the casualties required to take our positions. Our bunkers are strong. Our weapons are good. When they come, we will send them back into the sea." Weber's letter reflected the propaganda his generation had absorbed, the confidence his officers projected, and the reality disconnect that affected much of the Atlantic Wall garrison. These young soldiers had never experienced the overwhelming firepower that characterized Allied operations in 1944. They had never watched naval gunfire systematically destroy prepared positions. They had never faced enemies with effectively unlimited ammunition, air superiority, and the willingness to accept casualties that German commanders considered impossible. As dawn broke on June 6 and the massive invasion fleet revealed itself, these comfortable assumptions, the impregnable wall, the weak enemy, the strong defense, began their collision with reality. At 0550 hours, the Allied naval bombardment began. Klaus Zimmermann, still watching the fleet through his observation slit, saw the flashes first, bright orange blooms of fire erupting from the sides of battleships and cruisers. Then came the sound, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the air itself, followed by the shriek of incoming shells. The first naval round struck German positions 2 kilometers to Zimmermann's north. He watched massive explosions erupt along the cliff tops, entire bunker positions disappearing in eruptions of concrete dust, earth, and smoke. The shells were so large that their impact tremors could be felt through the ground, a physical sensation of violence that seemed impossible at such distances. "All personnel to battle stations." Oberst Richter's voice crackled over the field telephone connecting defensive positions. "Naval bombardment in progress. This is not a drill. This is the invasion. Stand to your weapons and prepare to engage landing forces. Deutschland über alles." In Strongpoint Wolfsburg 14, Zimmermann and his 3 fellow crew members took their positions around the MG-42. Hartmann checked the weapon's belt feed one final time, ensured the barrel change gloves were readily accessible, and settled himself behind the gun's sights. Through the embrasure, he could see landing craft forming up approximately 5,000 meters offshore, too far for machine gun fire, but visible as dark shapes against the gray water. The naval bombardment intensified. Shells began falling on Zimmermann's immediate sector, transforming the coastal landscape into a hellscape of explosions. A shell struck the bunker's roof with a tremendous crash, showering the crew with concrete dust but not penetrating the 3-foot-thick reinforcement. Another shell landed so close to the embrasure that Zimmermann was temporarily deafened, his ears ringing from the overpressure. "Hold positions!" Hartmann shouted over the din. "The bunker is strong. They cannot destroy us with naval fire." For 45 minutes, the bombardment continued. German positions along the coast erupted in flames and smoke as hundreds of Allied warships poured thousands of tons of high explosive onto the Atlantic wall defenses. Some bunkers were hit directly by battleship shells and simply ceased to exist, their crews killed instantly or buried in rubble. Others, like Wolfsburg 14, survived through the combination of luck and engineering, the shells landing just far enough away or at angles that prevented penetration of the thick concrete walls. At 0630 hours, the naval bombardment shifted inland, targeting German artillery positions and reserves. In the sudden relative quiet, Zimmermann could hear again. What he heard chilled him, the roar of hundreds of aircraft engines overhead as Allied bombers and fighters swept across the invasion area, bombing and strafing anything that moved. Through the smoke and dust, the first wave of landing craft became visible, approaching the beach at high speed. Zimmermann counted 20 craft in his immediate field of vision, each carrying what appeared to be 30 or 40 soldiers. Behind them, more waves were forming up, an endless procession of vessels bringing men toward his position. "Range 800 meters, Hartmann called, tracking the lead craft through his sights. "Wait for my command. We fire when they drop the ramps. Aim for the men exiting the craft. Make every round count." What Zimmermann didn't know, what none of the German defenders could see through the smoke and chaos, was that Allied planning had anticipated their defensive fire. The landing craft approaching his position were just one small element of a massive, coordinated assault hitting multiple beaches simultaneously. While German defenders focused on the threats in front of them, Allied forces were landing to their flanks, to their rear, isolating and overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers and coordination. The first landing craft reached the obstacles 400 meters from Zimmermann's position. Some struck mines and exploded, soldiers visible as tiny figures being thrown into the water. Others maneuvered between obstacles or grounded on the beach. Ramps dropped, and American infantry poured out, immediately coming under fire from multiple German positions. Fire! Hartmann squeezed the MG-42's trigger, and the weapon roared to life with its distinctive sound, so rapid that individual shots blurred into a continuous buzzsaw roar. Tracer rounds arced toward the landing craft, and Zimmermann saw men fall, saw others dive for cover behind beach obstacles. For the first 3 minutes, the defensive fire seemed effective. Landing craft were hit, soldiers fell, the beach approaches were swept by machine gun fire that created beaten zones nothing could survive. Zimmermann felt a surge of confidence, they were holding, the defenses were working, the enemy was dying on the beach just as doctrine predicted. Then reality asserted itself. More landing craft arrived, then more still. The beach that had seemed so deadly to the first wave was becoming crowded with Allied soldiers who had survived the initial killing ground and were now seeking cover, returning fire, preparing to advance. German machine gun positions that had been firing continuously were beginning to experience barrel overheating, forcing brief pauses to change barrels while landing craft continued to arrive uncontested during those critical seconds. Private Hans Weber, in his position 300 meters north of Hartmann, experienced the transformation from confidence to alarm. His MG-42 had fired nearly 600 rounds in the first 5 minutes, cutting down American soldiers with mechanical efficiency. Then his barrel overheated and had to be changed. During the 30 seconds required for the barrel change, 3 more landing craft reached the beach, and their soldiers, perhaps 120 men, scattered into cover before he could resume firing. "There are too many," Weber shouted to his loader. "We kill them and more come. It never stops." At 0710 hours, Allied naval fire shifted back to immediate coastal positions. A battleship shell struck the bunker complex 200 meters from Wolfsburg 14, penetrating directly through the embrasure and detonating inside. The explosion obliterated the position and everyone in it, leaving a smoking crater where a reinforced concrete bunker had stood minutes before. Zimmermann watched the destruction with growing horror. "Feldwebel, they're destroying our positions. What do we do?" Hartmann, his face grim, continued firing. "We fight. We have no other orders. Fire your rifle at the ones getting off the beach. Make them pay for every meter." But making them pay wasn't enough. For every American soldier the German defenders killed, 10 more reached the beach. For every landing craft destroyed, 5 more arrived. The mathematics Hartmann had been so confident about were working in reverse. German defenders had limited ammunition and were taking casualties they couldn't replace, while Allied forces had effectively unlimited reinforcement and were willing to accept casualties that would have broken a German assault. By 0800 hours, 2 hours into the invasion, Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann understood that everything he had been told about the Atlantic Wall was wrong. The impregnable defenses were being systematically destroyed by naval gunfire. The landing forces that were supposed to break against German firepower were establishing beachheads despite horrific casualties. The quick response from panzer divisions that was supposed to drive invaders back into the sea hadn't materialized. Later he would learn that Allied air superiority had made daylight movement of reserves impossible. Through his bunker's embrasure, now cracked from near-miss impacts, Zimmermann could see American soldiers advancing up the beach toward his position. They moved in small groups, using cover, supporting each other with rifle fire and grenades. Behind them, engineers were clearing obstacles and mines, while more landing craft continued to arrive in an unending stream. Feldwebel Hartmann had fired over 2,000 rounds through his MG-42, changing barrels 3 times, and American soldiers continued advancing. The weapon that was supposed to create an impassable killing zone had killed perhaps 15 men, but hundreds more had crossed the beach and were now threatening his position from multiple directions. "Ammunition status?" Hartmann demanded, his voice hoarse from shouting over the continuous noise of battle. 400 rounds remaining, Zimmermann reported, checking the ammunition cans in the bunker's rear. The supply bunker was destroyed. "This is all we have. 400 rounds." At the MG-42's rate of fire, that was 20 seconds of continuous firing. The ammunition that was supposed to sustain them for over an hour of combat would be exhausted in less than 1 minute if they maintained their current firing rate. "Controlled bursts only," Hartmann ordered. 3 to 5 round bursts at confirmed targets. "Make every round count." Through his observation slit, Zimmermann watched as American engineers approached the bunker's blind spots, the areas immediately adjacent to the structure that could not be covered by the embrasure's limited field of fire. The bunker's design, which had seemed so clever during construction, now became a liability. German defenders could shoot at enemies hundreds of meters away but couldn't engage threats that got close to the structure. At 0835 hours, something struck the bunker's roof with tremendous force, not a naval shell but a satchel charge thrown by American combat engineers who had reached the position. The explosion was muffled by the concrete but powerful enough to crack the ceiling reinforcement. Dust and small fragments of concrete rained down on the crew. "They're on top of us," Weber shouted into his radio from his nearby position, which was experiencing the same treatment. "Request permission to abandon position and fall back to secondary line." The response from Oberst Richter, directing the defense from his command bunker 2 kilometers inland, was immediate and uncompromising: "All positions will hold. No retreat authorized. You will fight in your positions to the last man and last round." This is a direct order. But reality cared nothing for orders. Weber's position, subjected to repeated satchel charge attacks and unable to return effective fire against enemies in its blind spots, became untenable. when the fourth satchel charge detonated directly on the bunker's embrasure, killing his loader and wounding him severely, Weber and his surviving crew member abandoned the position and fled toward the rear. They didn't make it far. American rifle fire caught them within 50 meters. Weber was killed instantly. His companion, wounded, was captured within minutes, the first prisoner from the Atlantic Wall defenses. In Strongpoint Wolfsburg 14, Zimmermann heard the radio transmission of Weber's position being overrun and understood that his bunker was now isolated, cut off from support, with American forces closing in from multiple directions. Hartmann continued firing short, disciplined bursts at targets he could see, but for every American soldier he hit, 10 more advanced from directions the bunker couldn't cover. At 0920 hours, nearly 4 hours into the battle, American soldiers reached close enough to Wolfsburg 14 to employ flamethrowers against the embrasure. Zimmermann watched in horror as a stream of burning fuel jetted through the opening, forcing Hartmann to abandon his weapon and the crew to retreat to the bunker's rear compartment. "We cannot fight them," one of the crew members, a young soldier named Otto Schreiber, screamed over the roar of flames. "We must surrender or die." Hartmann, his face blackened by smoke and his uniform singed, made the calculation every German commander was making that morning along the Normandy coast. They had fought well. They had inflicted casualties. But the Americans kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless, their firepower overwhelming, their determination absolute. Continuing to fight from an isolated bunker with minimal ammunition against enemies who could destroy the position at their leisure was not courage, it was suicide for no tactical gain. "Prepare to surrender," Hartmann ordered, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. "Remove your weapons. Hands up. We're done." Zimmermann felt an overwhelming wave of emotion, relief that he might survive, shame that they were giving up, confusion about how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The Atlantic Wall that was supposed to repel any invasion had lasted less than 4 hours against his sector's attackers. The defenses that propaganda had promised were impregnable had been penetrated, overrun, and rendered irrelevant by an enemy whose scale and determination exceeded everything German planning had anticipated. While Zimmermann and Hartmann prepared to surrender their isolated bunker, the larger battle along the Normandy coast entered its critical phase. German defensive positions that had survived the naval bombardment and initial infantry assaults were being systematically reduced by combined arms attacks that overwhelmed defenders through coordination rather than individual heroism. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schneider, commanding a strongpoint complex 3 kilometers from Wolfsburg 14, watched through his binoculars as American forces executed textbook combined operations against his positions. Naval gunfire would suppress a bunker, preventing the defenders from firing. Infantry would advance during the suppression. Engineers would approach with demolitions. Artillery smoke would screen the final assault. Each defensive position was being neutralized through methodical application of overwhelming firepower rather than frontal assault. "They're not charging our guns like we expected," Schneider told his battalion commander over a crackling field telephone connection. The battalion commander, Oberst Richter, had no solutions to offer. His carefully prepared defensive system was disintegrating under a type of warfare German doctrine hadn't adequately prepared for: industrial-scale application of firepower that treated concrete bunkers and field fortifications as minor obstacles to be removed rather than significant defensive advantages. "Hold your positions as long as possible," Richter ordered, though even he understood the order was increasingly meaningless. "Panzer support is moving forward and will counterattack this afternoon." But the promised Panzer counterattack was stuck in traffic jams and under constant air attack, moving at walking pace through roads clogged with refugees and destroyed by Allied bombing. The quick armored response that was supposed to drive invaders back into the sea would arrive far too late, if it arrived at all. By 1100 hours, 5 hours into the invasion, the Atlantic Wall defenses along the critical landing sectors had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. Some positions continued fighting, isolated and cut off. Others had been destroyed by naval gunfire or overwhelmed by infantry assault. Many, like Wolfsburg 14, had surrendered when continuing resistance became pointless. Lieutenant Franz Müller, commanding an artillery observation post that had somehow survived the naval bombardment, watched the transformation of the beach from deadly killing ground to secure Allied staging area. Landing craft arrived continuously, unloading tanks, artillery, vehicles, and endless streams of soldiers. German artillery attempting to engage these targets was suppressed immediately by counter-battery fire of such volume and accuracy that after the first few missions, German gunners refused to fire more than a single round before displacing, if they fired at all. "They own the air completely," Müller reported to his regimental headquarters. "They own the sea. They're establishing ownership of the land. We inflicted casualties, thousands perhaps, but they absorbed them and continued. What kind of enemy accepts such losses and keeps advancing?" The answer, which German commanders were slowly, reluctantly coming to understand, was an enemy with industrial capacity so vast that they could afford to lose men, equipment, and material at rates Germany considered unsustainable, and still maintain overwhelming superiority. Every German soldier killed was irreplaceable. Every Allied soldier killed would be replaced, often within hours, from reserves that seemed inexhaustible. Feldwebel Ernst Hartmann, now a prisoner being marched away from Wolfsburg 14 along with his surviving crew, watched American reinforcements landing and understood what defeat meant. Not defeat in this battle, defeat in the war. The Atlantic Wall was broken. The Allies had a foothold in France. Nothing Germany could do would push them back into the sea now. The most the Wehrmacht could hope for was to slow the inevitable advance, to make the Allies pay for every mile, but they would advance, mile by bloody mile, until Germany was crushed. "How many soldiers do they have?" Zimmermann asked one of the American guards, speaking in broken English he'd learned in school. The guard, a corporal from Wisconsin, smiled grimly. "Enough. More than enough. However many it takes." That answer, more than anything else that terrible day, captured the reality German defenders had faced. The Allies had brought however many soldiers it would take, however many ships it would require, however much ammunition was necessary. They had planned for German resistance and brought forces sufficient to overwhelm it. They had accepted that casualties would be horrific and brought enough men that horrific casualties wouldn't stop them. The Atlantic Wall, for years in construction, manned by 50,000 soldiers, protected by thousands of bunkers and obstacles, had bought Germany approximately 6 hours before being definitively breached. In those 6 hours, perhaps 4,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded. In exchange, Allied forces had established an unshakable foothold on occupied Europe that would lead, 11 months later, to Germany's unconditional surrender. As Zimmermann was marched past American supply dumps already being established on what had been his defensive sector that morning, he saw the scales of industrial warfare made manifest. Trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, ammunition crates, fuel drums, medical supplies, all stacked in mountains that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could have supplied. This wasn't just an army landing. This was an industrial system arriving on a beach, ready to sustain itself indefinitely while grinding German resistance into dust. The Atlantic Wall had been an illusion. Not because the fortifications were weak, they weren't. Not because the defenders lacked courage, they had fought bravely. The illusion was believing that concrete and courage could stop an enemy with absolute command of sea and air, unlimited industrial resources, and the willingness to pay any price necessary for victory. On June 6, 1944, reality had shattered that illusion with overwhelming, undeniable force. Return fire. Anti-aircraft positions engage. Steiner ordered, but the column's 2 self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles were at the rear of the column and couldn't bring their weapons to bear before the fighters made their second pass. This time, bombs fell. Fischer watched in horror as the lead tank in the column, Steiner's command vehicle, disappeared in an explosion that left a smoking crater where the tank had been. The company commander and his crew were simply gone, vaporized by a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. The air attack lasted approximately 3 minutes. When the fighters departed to rearm, Steiner's 14-tank company had been reduced to 8 operational vehicles. 6 tanks destroyed or immobilized. The company commander dead. The survivors scattered along 2 kilometers of Norman Road with no way to continue the advance and no orders beyond reach the coast. Lieutenant Fischer, now the senior surviving officer, made the calculation that thousands of German officers were making that day across Normandy. Continuing the attack was suicide. His remaining tanks couldn't reach the coast, the roads were death traps under Allied air superiority. They couldn't stay on the road, more air attacks were inevitable. They couldn't fight effectively without infantry support, which was nowhere to be seen. All vehicles, withdraw to assembly area, Fischer transmitted. We cannot complete the mission. The sky belongs to the enemy. The counterattack that was supposed to drive the Allies back into the sea had been destroyed 7 kilometers from its objective, having never fired 12 kilometers inland from the beaches where Klaus Zimmermann had surrendered his bunker. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner of the 21st Panzer Division received the order he had been waiting for since before dawn: advance to coast. Counterattack landing forces. Drive enemy into sea. At 1430 hours on June 6, nearly 9 hours after the invasion began, Steiner's company of Panzer IV tanks, 14 vehicles that had survived years of Eastern Front combat, began moving toward the sound of naval gunfire that had been audible all morning. His orders were clear: reach the beaches, link up with surviving coastal defenses, and destroy the Allied beachhead before it could be consolidated. What Steiner didn't know, what German commanders from regimental to army level didn't fully comprehend, was that the counterattack they had planned for months was already obsolete. The roads his panzers needed to travel were clogged with refugees and destroyed by bombing. The tactical surprise they had counted on was impossible because Allied air superiority meant every movement was observed and attacked. Most critically, the narrow beachhead they expected to crush no longer existed. Allied forces had penetrated several kilometers inland in multiple sectors and were expanding their foothold by the hour. Maintain radio discipline, Steiner ordered his tank commanders as the column began moving. Expect air attack at any time. Our mission is to reach the coast before nightfall and attack at dawn tomorrow if we cannot attack today. They made it 7 kilometers before the fighter bombers found them. Lieutenant Hans Fischer, commanding the 2nd tank in Steiner's column, was the first to see them, 4 Allied fighter aircraft appearing from behind a tree line at less than 500 meters altitude, already in their attack run before German commanders could react. Aircraft! Scatter! Fischer screamed into his radio, but scatter was impossible on the narrow Norman road flanked by stone walls and hedgerows. His tank, attempting to move off the road, crashed through a wall only to become partially stuck, its tracks spinning uselessly. The fighter bombers, American P-47 Thunderbolts armed with rockets and bombs, made their first pass. Rockets streaked toward the column, and Fischer's tank shuddered as a near-miss explosion lifted its left track off the ground momentarily. The tank ahead of his exploded as a direct rocket hit penetrated its thinner top armor, brewing up in a pillar of flame and black smoke. Shot at enemy ground forces. It was a pattern repeating across the entire Normandy front: German mobile reserves unable to reach battle zones, destroyed piecemeal by air attacks, arriving too late and in too small numbers to affect the outcome. At Oberst Friedrich Richter's command post, established in a commandeered farmhouse 5 kilometers from the coast, the reality of catastrophic defeat was manifesting through a cascade of horrifying radio reports and the complete breakdown of command and control. Strongpoint Adler destroyed. No survivors observed. Coastal battery Bismarck silenced by naval fire. Position abandoned. Reserve battalion unable to advance. Road destroyed. Heavy casualties from air attack. Panzer counterattack stalled. Company strength reduced to 8 vehicles. Each report represented another piece of the defensive system Richter had spent months building, now crumbling in real time. But worse than the tactical reports was the complete disruption of communications. Allied jamming and the destruction of telephone lines meant that many positions went silent without explanation, destroyed, surrendered, or simply cut off. Richter couldn't know which. Herr Oberst, we have lost contact with 60% of coastal positions, his operations officer reported at 1,600 hours. Naval gunfire has destroyed most communications infrastructure. We cannot coordinate defensive operations when we cannot communicate with our forces. Richter studied the situation map, now covered with markers indicating destroyed positions, cut communications, and enemy penetrations. The defensive line that had existed on paper that morning simply no longer existed in reality. Allied forces had established multiple lodgements, some extending 3 kilometers inland. German counterattacks had failed to materialize or been destroyed en route. Casualties were catastrophic, estimated at over 40% of the coastal garrison in 12 hours of fighting. Sent to Army Group Headquarters, Richter dictated to his communications officer. Coastal defenses breached multiple sectors. Heavy casualties. Counterattacks ineffective due to air superiority. Request immediate reinforcement and authorization to conduct fighting withdrawal to prepared positions inland. Current positions untenable. The response, when it came 2 hours later, was predictable: all positions will hold. No withdrawal authorized. Counterattack to be renewed tomorrow morning with all available forces. Heil Hitler. But there were no available forces. The Panzer divisions that were supposed to restore the situation were being destroyed on approach roads. The infantry reserves were pinned down by naval gunfire and air attacks. The artillery that was supposed to break up enemy concentrations was being systematically eliminated by counter-battery fire of unprecedented accuracy and volume. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, commanding the artillery battalion supporting Richter's sector, experienced the impossibility of fighting under Allied fire superiority firsthand. His 12 artillery pieces had fired their first mission at 0730 hours, engaging landing craft on the beaches with indirect fire. Within 4 minutes, Allied counter-battery fire had located his positions and commenced bombardment with such volume and precision that Hoffmann ordered immediate displacement. "We fired 6 rounds, Hoffmann told Richter during a personal visit to the command post at 1700 hours. 6 rounds from 12 guns. The response was approximately 300 rounds of naval gunfire that destroyed 2 guns and killed 11 men. We attempted to displace and fire from alternate positions. Same result. Every time we fire, massive counter-battery response within minutes. We cannot suppress enemy forces. We can barely survive. Then we fight with what we have," Richter replied, though his voice carried no conviction. Infantry with their personal weapons. Anti-tank guns in direct fire role. Close combat. But Hoffmann's assessment was more realistic. "Herr Oberst, we cannot win this battle. The enemy has unlimited artillery, complete air superiority, and apparently infinite ammunition. Every soldier we commit is wasted. Every position we defend is eventually destroyed. We should withdraw to defensible terrain inland and force them to fight for every kilometer rather than dying uselessly in positions we cannot hold." Richter wanted to agree, but orders were orders. German military culture did not permit tactical flexibility in the face of strategic reality. Stand and die was the order, even when standing accomplished nothing except increasing casualty counts. By nightfall on June 6, Richter's command had effectively ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. Approximately 65% of his troops were dead, wounded, or captured. His communications network was destroyed. His artillery was suppressed or destroyed. His defensive positions were either overrun or bypassed. Yet according to Army Group Headquarters, he was still expected to counterattack in the morning and restore the coastal defenses. The delusion would continue until reality made it impossible to ignore. While Panzer divisions died on approach roads and command posts lost contact with their forces, individual German soldiers were discovering that the terrain of Normandy, the dense hedgerows and sunken lanes that had seemed like defensive advantages, had become death traps when facing an enemy with unlimited firepower and air superiority. Obergefreiter Paul Werner, a machine gunner who had survived the beach defenses collapse and withdrawn inland with a mixed group of survivors, found himself defending a hedgerow position 4 kilometers from the coast on the afternoon of June 6. His improvised squad, soldiers from 3 different units who had retreated together, occupied a sunken lane with good fields of fire across open farmland toward the coast. "They'll come this way," the squad's self-appointed leader, Feldwebel Anton Becker, predicted. "The Americans will advance inland from the beach. We'll let them cross the open ground, then hit them with machine gun fire when they're exposed." Standard defensive tactics. But standard defensive tactics presumed both sides fought with comparable resources. What approached Werner's position was an American infantry company with tank support, artillery on call, and air observation that had already identified every German defensive position in the area. At 1,640 hours, American artillery began ranging the hedgerow positions. Not the brief, inaccurate bombardment German doctrine anticipated, but a sustained, methodical destruction of every position that might contain defenders. Shells walked across the hedgerow line, systematically obliterating each defensive position in sequence. Werner huddled in his foxhole as explosions marched toward his position. "They're firing at empty ground," he shouted to Becker, who was 10 meters away in his own fighting position. "They're wasting ammunition." But they weren't wasting ammunition, they were demonstrating that they had so much ammunition that they could afford to destroy every possible defensive position rather than risk their infantry finding out which positions actually contained defenders. It was industrial warfare at its most fundamental, used material superiority to save soldiers' lives. When the artillery fire lifted after 20 minutes, Werner cautiously raised his head and looked across the field. Through the smoke and dust, he could see American infantry advancing, but not in the massed formations German doctrine anticipated. They moved in small groups, covered by tank fire, communicating with hand signals, using terrain expertly. "Fire!" Becker ordered, and Werner opened up with his MG-42, tracer rounds arcing toward the advancing Americans. He hit 2 men, saw them fall, felt a brief surge of success, then American tanks identified his muzzle flash and returned fire with their main guns and machine guns. The concentrated return fire was overwhelming. Tank shells exploded around Werner's position, showering him with dirt and fragments. Machine gun bullets chewed apart the hedgerow that had seemed like such good cover. Grenades arced over the hedge. The Americans weren't charging his position suicidally, they were destroying it systematically before advancing. "Fall back!" Becker screamed after less than 3 minutes of engagement. "We cannot hold here." Werner grabbed his weapon and ran, along with the 5 other survivors from the squad of 12. They withdrew through orchards and across fields, constantly under fire from pursuing Americans, until they reached another hedgerow position 500 meters to the rear, where they discovered more German soldiers who had also withdrawn, and who told the same story: overwhelming American firepower, systematic destruction of positions, casualties they couldn't sustain, withdrawal because standing and dying accomplished nothing. By nightfall, Werner's group had withdrawn 3 times, each time trading space for survival, each time losing men to American fire that seemed unlimited and omnipresent. The defensive line that was supposed to hold at the coast had become a fluid series of delaying actions fought by ad hoc groups who retreated rather than die in positions they couldn't defend. German doctrine called it unauthorized withdrawal. The soldiers called it staying alive long enough to fight tomorrow. American forces called it the collapse of German coastal defenses. If there was a single factor that German survivors of D-Day cited as most devastating, most psychologically destructive, and most tactically decisive, it was Allied air superiority. The sky that had been at least contested in earlier years of the war had become an exclusively Allied domain where German movement during daylight was virtual suicide. Hauptmann George Richter, no relation to Oberst Friedrich Richter, commanding a motorized infantry company ordered to reinforce coastal defenses on the afternoon of June 6, experienced the deadly reality of moving under enemy air supremacy. His company, 150 men in trucks, with supporting weapons and ammunition, began moving at 1,500 hours on what should have been a 3-hour journey to the coast. German doctrine called for movement in daylight because night movement was slow and difficult. But German doctrine hadn't accounted for an enemy who could observe and attack every vehicle on every road in real time. 20 minutes into the movement, Richter's lead truck driver spotted aircraft approaching and the column scattered, vehicles pulling off roads and soldiers diving for ditches. The fighters, Royal Air Force Typhoons this time, made their pass, firing rockets and cannon at the dispersed vehicles. 2 trucks were destroyed, 7 men killed. Richter ordered the column to resume movement, but 10 minutes later more fighters appeared. This time American P-38 Lightnings, strafing the road with cannon fire. 3 more trucks destroyed, 12 men killed or wounded. We cannot continue, Richter's executive officer argued after the third air attack in 90 minutes. Every time we move, they find us. We've lost 1/3 of our vehicles and haven't traveled 20 kilometers. At this rate, the entire company will be destroyed before we reach the coast. But orders were orders. The company continued moving, now with vehicles spaced 200 meters apart to reduce losses from individual attacks, now pulling off roads at the sound of any aircraft engine, now taking hours to travel distances that should have required minutes. They never reached the coast. At 19:30 hours, still 15 kilometers from their objective, Richter received orders to halt and establish defensive positions where they stood. The counterattack they were supposed to support had been cancelled. The positions they were supposed to reinforce had been overrun. Their movement had cost 43 men and 20 vehicles to reach a position that accomplished nothing. "Welcome to the new warfare," a veteran Feldwebel told Richter as they dug in for the night. "The enemy owns the sky. Anything that moves dies. We can fight at night or we can die during the day. There is no third option." The psychological impact of this reality was devastating. German soldiers had fought for years under conditions where air superiority shifted back and forth. They had never experienced total enemy air dominance where simply being visible outdoors during daylight meant death was imminent. The constant stress of scanning the sky, of diving for cover at the sound of engines, of watching comrades killed by enemies they couldn't fight back against, it was breaking unit cohesion faster than ground combat. Lieutenant Franz Kemper, a platoon commander who survived the first week of the Normandy campaign, wrote in his diary on June 9, "We do not sleep because of aircraft. The sound of engines, any engines, causes immediate panic. Men refuse to move during day. Some have deserted, preferring court-martial to certain death from air attack. I do not blame them. The sky has become our executioner, and we are helpless before it." General Major Wilhelm Becker, the division commander who had watched his unit disintegrate in 48 hours, was captured on June 18 when his command post was overrun by American forces. His post-war memoir, published in 1952, included his assessment of D-Day from the German perspective. "We were defending Europe against the greatest invasion in history with approximately 50,000 men and fixed fortifications. The Allies attacked with over 150,000 men in the first wave, supported by naval gunfire that could level cities, air power that owned the sky, and logistical systems that treated ammunition and supplies as infinite resources. No defensive system could have stopped that invasion," Becker wrote. "The Atlantic Wall was adequate for repelling a raid or even a modest invasion force. But this was not a raid. This was the industrial output of 3 nations, America, Britain, and Canada, concentrated against one coastline on one day. We fought as well as men could fight. We delayed them. We made them pay for every meter. But we could not stop them because stopping them was physically, mathematically impossible. The tragedy," Becker concluded, "is that our commanders knew this and sent us to die anyway. Not because dying would change the outcome, but because admitting defeat was politically impossible. So young soldiers died in bunkers that could not be defended, fighting battles that could not be won, sacrificing themselves for a cause that was already lost." In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, a Franco-German reconciliation ceremony brought together veterans of both sides. Klaus Zimmermann, now 63, met an American veteran who had landed on the beach below his bunker position that morning. "Did you know you were going to win?" Zimmermann asked through a translator. The American veteran, a former sergeant named James Mitchell, answered honestly, "No. We thought many of us would die. We expected heavy casualties. But we knew more would come. We knew that even if the first wave failed, there would be a second wave, a third wave, however many waves it took. We had been told the invasion would succeed regardless of casualties because failure was not acceptable." "That's what we couldn't defeat," Zimmermann replied. "Not your courage, we had courage too. Not your weapons, we had good weapons. We couldn't defeat your determination to win regardless of cost. Germany couldn't afford the casualties you accepted. We had to protect every soldier because we had no reserves. You could spend lives like ammunition because you had reserves. In that arithmetic, we lost before the first shot was fired. The final word belongs perhaps to Oberst Friedrich Richter, the regimental commander who had watched his defensive system disintegrate over 48 hours. In private letters discovered after his death in 1968, Richter wrote, "June 6, 1944, was the day I understood that World War II was lost. Not because of that day's fighting, but because of what that day revealed about Allied capabilities. An operation of such scale, such precision, such overwhelming force, this was beyond Germany's ability to match or counter. We had been fighting since 1939. We had conquered most of Europe. We believed in our superiority. Then in a single morning, we watched an armada appear that dwarfed anything we could have assembled. We fought back with everything we had, and it made no difference. They absorbed our best punches and kept advancing. That's when I knew the war was over. We just didn't know it yet. History will say D-Day succeeded because of Allied courage and planning. Both are true. But what really defeated us was simpler: they had more. More ships, more planes, more tanks, more men, more ammunition, more everything. And in warfare, more matters. Courage matters. Skill matters. But more matters most. We ran out of everything before they ran out of anything. That's why we lost.